Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
So glad you're with us for the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Happy Valentine's Day. If your blood pressure just spiked because you haven't bought anything yet and you just realized it is Valentine's Day, well, now's the time to act, or at least before you get home. And if you're a federal worker in Washington, you probably are not working at home anymore, so you have a chance to hit the store on your way home. Jim?
Grocery stores usually have a good selection, and the prices are, look, you're going to pay the most today than any other day for a dozen roses, but they're still pretty reasonable. But if you really want to say, I love you to that special someone, you know what will knock her socks off? A dozen eggs. That's, wow.
That's commitment right there.
That's more better than a diamond,
Yes. Well, we've got good, bad, and crazy one, which will eventually be a good news item. It's just going to take longer than we probably would want. But in terms of national security, first of all, Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, has been overseas for the past several days, as has the Vice President. First of all, over at the Free Beacon, related to Pete Hegseth, he says the Pentagon's Biden-era climate initiatives may soon be on the chopping block as President Donald Trump moves to cut wasteful military spending while ramping up the overall defense budget. Quote, there is waste, redundancies, and headcounts at headquarters that need to be addressed. There's just no doubt, Hegseth told Axios Tuesday, pointing to climate-related spending that the Biden administration classified as a national security priority. The Defense Department is in the business of deterring and winning wars, not solving the global thermostat, Hegseth said. He added that Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, will begin reviewing the Pentagon spending very soon. The move is part of Trump's broader effort to rein in government waste. And Jim, I know you follow the Russia-Ukraine situation very closely. You've been over there a couple of times, and we've got comments also from J.D. Vance suggesting that as Trump tries to ramp up these talks to end the Russia-Ukraine war, that it's going to be a little bit more detailed and balanced than what we saw in that tweet after the call from Putin earlier in the week, where Vance is saying, look, nothing is off the table. There could be military tools. There could be economic leverage. We've certainly seen sanctions from the previous administration and so forth. And so we don't know what it's going to look like. But we also saw Hegseth walking back his earlier statements about NATO and territorial boundaries and so forth. So you just don't know what's coming, which for those who were a little bit concerned at the first Trump comments are probably encouraged.
Yeah, look, this is an imperfect but generally good Munich Security Conference with a lot of very bracing talk to European allies that have really gotten used to the U.S. doing the lion's share of the work in the alliance, the lion's share of military spending and all of that. Beginning with Hegseth on the climate change initiatives and things like that. I am one of those conservatives who believe that, yes, there is waste in the Pentagon budget, and that I want the boys at DOG, I want the auditors, I want them to go through and say, hey, do we actually need this? There's a big chunk of this is the fact that what we actually spend money on for defense gets set by members of Congress who really want that system that's produced in their home district or their home state to be prioritized. And defense planners say, well, actually, we need more of this and less of that. But overall, there are programs that have long since outlived their usefulness. It's very tough to reform the Pentagon. Really important work to be done here by Hegseth, and so I'm hoping this is a encouraging sign, and it's an acknowledgement that yes, not every penny in my budget is sacrosanct. Would I like to see an overall increase in defense spending? Yes, but that doesn't mean that every dime that's being spent right now is going in the right where it should be, or giving American taxpayers bang for their buck. Literally, in some cases, but not everything they spend money on goes bang. The second thing that kind of jumps out here, and by the way, Hegseth's first comment at the Munich Security Conference, where he said that the U.S. was basically taking Ukraine membership in NATO off the table, and that U.S. would not be playing any role in any post-war negotiated settlement peacekeeping forces. Didn't like either one of those because you basically are like, whether or not that's the U.S. position, and I think it's the other thing he said was that the U.S. would not, it was unreasonable to expect Ukraine to take back all of its territory, including Crimea. Now, as listeners know, I've been over there twice. The Ukrainians don't like acknowledging that. As an American, I don't need every last square centimeter of that territory back. I do need the consequence of this war to be so dire that Russia does not want to ever do this ever again. So the first statement was reasonable. I just don't know if you want to go out and announce that before you make the negotiations. Maybe it's better to leave Russia guessing what concessions you're willing to make. But overall, he walked it back the next day and said, look, all options are the table. It's the president's decision. And it was a little, maybe a little bit of crow they had to eat there, but it was probably better for the U.S. to say, hey, we haven't decided anything yet. Don't assume that you've already got these concessions. The other point about the two comments from Vance, his statements in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, there's been some question about whether this is, represents Vance threatening Putin, as the headline of the Wall Street Journal said. But nonetheless, it was look, I am just glad that after all this talk by Blinken and Sullivan and all these mealy-mouthed, mush we've heard from the Biden administration, we have finally got a real interventionist hawk. Somebody who is tough and is not afraid to say, hey, we have military options, Putin, from J.D. Vance, who had once said, I don't really care what happened. I know Vance was not going out, and it's not quite as aggressive as I characterized it a moment ago, but he is mentioning that the U.S. has military options if Putin does not come to the table and does not play ball on peace talks, which is not a message we heard from the Biden administration, was not a message we've heard from anybody else. So I kind of enjoy that perfect irony that Vance, the guy who was seen as sort of isolationist, is it's a little bit only Nixon could go to China. And I think it does send a message to the Russians that even Vance is on board with messages like this. But that's not all he said at the Munich Security Conference, Greg.
No, that's exactly right. And he had some tough words in a number of different forums for leaders in Europe, most of which probably were not well received. But in terms of squelching free speech and even praying silently within 50 yards of an abortion clinic, it's a statement on a lot of levels that I think needed to be said. But in terms of his thoughts on Germany, where the conference was held in Munich, he had some very interesting thoughts on Germany's curious policy changes over the past decade plus, not only in terms of accepting the number of migrants from inflamed areas of the Middle East, but also in terms of doing the exact opposite of what you think it would be doing if it was increasingly concerned about Russia.
Germany is the one country, maybe, in NATO that did not follow the stupid Washington consensus and allow their country to be deindustrialized during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And yet at the very moment that Putin is more and more powerful, where the Russian army is invading European countries en masse, this is the point at which Germany starts to deindustrialize. Look at the number of people working in manufacturing in Germany now versus 10 years ago. Look at the critical raw materials produced in Germany now versus 10 years ago. The energy dependence now versus 10 or 20 years ago. We have got to stop deindustrializing. We want Europe to be successful, but Europe has got to take a bigger role in its own security. You can't do that without industry.
And if you look back at the era these decisions were made, Jim, and as you have written before, what was Angela Merkel thinking?
Well, first of all, that audio clip there, Greg, boy, that's as good as it gets. I haven't seen that many Germans get hit that hard since the last Indiana Jones movie. Because here's the thing, and I've noticed this throughout the entire conflict, the Russians, since Russia invaded back in February 2022, the German government makes a lot of comments. Their chancellors say that they're doing a lot to help Ukraine and that they're willing to rearm and it's time to, wake up from our holiday from history, as Charles Krauthammer characterized it. But when it comes to that, I really take the Norm Macdonald position, or so the Germans would have us believe, which he would periodically say, because they keep saying they do it, but you don't actually see the military spending increases. You don't see this genuine harder line on this. And I'm glad you mentioned Merkel. It was actually John Schindler had written about this a while ago. One of the facts I've wanted to get into the thriller novel series for a long time, based on real on truth, is that back when she was a college student, Angela Merkel of Germany grew up in East Germany, and she was approached by the Stasi, the secret police, and they attempted to recruit her as a source. She says she said no, and nothing more came of it, or so the Germans would have us believe. Or as far as anyone knows, that was the extent of her contact with them. It's kind of interesting. They did the Stasi, this widely feared, all-seeing, very sinister, secret police were trying to get her into the ranks. A couple people have said, are we sure that was the extent of their, they haven't found anything in the archives that would necessarily point to this, but they've never had access to the KGB archives from that time period. It was Angela Merkel, a Russian agent the whole time? Probably not. But one of the things that, you notice that's not a resolute, no. You look at all of her decision making. She made Germany weaker on a whole bunch of fronts and is now really seen by wide varieties of the German people, including a bunch of former allies, as somebody who made really terrible decisions. I did mention this in my piece, but I should point out the widespread letting in migrants from Syria during the Syrian civil war. A lot of tensions in Germany over that. But I think even more importantly, the deindustrialization that Vance talked about, the increasing dependence on Russian energy, which is really important. She shut down the nuclear energy industry in Germany, which is what created that, their sudden need for this. Didn't keep military spending at a level commensurate with the needs of the country. The German economy is heavily reliant on Chinese exports to China, which all of a sudden means you're now dependent on the goodwill of Beijing. On all of these, and so as I said, what is the less disturbing scenario? That Merkel was pursuing these policies that weakened her country because she was secretly on the payroll of the Russians or some other sinister force. Does it make you feel better if this is what she really thought was the best idea? Does that... After a while, you're like, God, I hope she was working for the Russians. That at least makes sense. I'd hate to think she was dumb enough to time and time again keep picking the option that left her country in a weaker position than before. Again, I don't know that Angela Merkel was deliberately sabotaging Germany for the entire time she was in power, but people really are ripping into her. She also wrote a memoir in which she said basically nothing she did was wrong, and she didn't concede any mistakes. And you'd think you'd be like, God, worst German chancellor ever. But it turns out there's there's some worse ones that you probably want to. It's really tough to take the title of worst German chancellor ever.
Yeah, I mean, as Norm Macdonald likes to say, I don't know if you guys are history buffs, but
yes, a little tough. This is the most Norm Macdonald focused analysis of Germany you're going to find on the internet.
Would you rather your chancellor be corrupt or incompetent? I kind of prefer them to be incompetent, actually. I think the damage would be more easily reversible, but I don't know. Either way, it's not good.
You figure an incompetent one will, like a broken clock being right twice a day. Once in a while, they'll get something right. Somebody who's working for the other side probably will.
That's a fair point. All right. Well, somehow this good martini took a turn for the sinister, but let's keep it on the good news front as we relate to artificial intelligence, because even if you think it's a little bit overhyped, AI is suddenly everywhere, from self-driving cars to molecular medicine to business efficiency. And if it's not in your industry yet, it's coming fast. But AI needs a lot of speed and computing power. So how do you compete without your costs spiraling out of control? Well, that means it's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud. It's called Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI.
OCI is a blazing fast and secure platform for all of your infrastructure, database, and application development needs, plus all of your artificial intelligence and machine learning workloads. OCI costs 50% less for computing and 80% less for networking, so you're saving a pile of money. Thousands of businesses have already upgraded to OCI, including Vodafone, Thomson Reuters, and Suno AI.
Right now, Oracle is offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to OCI. It's for new U.S. customers with minimum financial commitment. Offer ends March 31st. See if your company qualifies for this special offer at oracle.com/martini. That's oracle.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini. It's a subject of your Friday morning jolt. And just a couple of days ago, we found out that the year-over-year inflation rate for January was 3%, the highest it's been year-over-year on a monthly basis in over a year. And of course, the finger pointing is already out. The left is blaming Trump. People on the right are saying, of course, most of that time Biden was still president, in case you didn't notice. It does take time to turn the boat around, as we like to say on these things. But now it's all during the Trump administration from here on out, over the next few years anyway. And so while you can point to bad policies making it harder to turn the ship around, it's now your responsibility to get it done. And so I think there are a number of ways, Jim, that progress can be made. He's talked a lot about, of course, increasing our exploration of energy. If you get more energy, the supply is up, it meets the demand, the price goes down, and then you can move other things around, all goods and services, and therefore the overall cost of those things goes lower because the energy, the fuel is lower. Also, as you're going through all this examination of where our tax dollars are being spent in government, hopefully that helps to some extent. But I think the main point you're trying to make here in the Morning Jolt today is that this is going to be a massive issue in terms of how people view this presidency. You can do a lot of other things they agree with. Maybe you'll infuriate some people on some other things. But just like we saw in the last election, if people aren't happy on this front, they're not going to like you very much.
By the way, Greg, are you sticking with the nautical metaphors? Because earlier today, the USS Harry S. Truman had a collision with a merchant vessel. Everybody's fine, no accident, but it just was first, no damage to the ship that's serious, no casualties. But I'm just going to point out, how do you not see an aircraft carrier? Like,
I don't know.
They're pretty big. You kind of figure you'd see them coming. Are you backing out of the driveway and you didn't see? So anyway, on inflation. Look, the 3% is not terrible. It's certainly not as bad as, it was back in 2021, 2022. But it's a little ominous. And we noted in that CBS poll that we were talking about at the beginning of the week, generally high remarks, but 66% of Americans said Trump was not spending enough time focusing on high prices and the cost of living. I think this is a consequence when Trump is doing a million things a day and executive orders and tariffs, and he's going to head the Kennedy Center, and there's just a lot going on. And look, it's Trump's presidency. He can run it the way he wants. But when people elected you because the cost of living is high, because prices are high, they want you to see a focus on it. And I think I think this is where we're going to take over Greenland. Canada's going to be a state. I think some of that stuff gets in the way of the message they'll probably do the administration the most good. You look at that. The other two areas I focus on: egg prices. Yes, there's not much you can do about it. We killed a lot of chickens because of the bird flu outbreak. You have to wait for the chickens that have been born to get large enough so they can become egg-laying age. So it's going to take some time. That is, of course, the egg prices are at the all-time high. Not great. And you go through, you think about it, it's not just, you go to you're like, oh, what am I going to have for breakfast? Eggs are used in ingredients in all kinds of other stuff. Bread, pasta, mayonnaise, so all kinds of other things that you buy that you don't even necessarily realize have eggs in them. Their prices are going to go up too. Considering how high grocery prices had a really big effect on Biden's political fortunes, I would be keeping a sharp eye on this. And then finally on gas prices, look at the national, the national average of gas, and you look at passage. It's not terribly high right now, but also it's February. It's not a particularly strong, busy time of year when it comes to driving. You generally see the prices go up in throughout spring, approaching Memorial Days when they usually are around their peak, or 4th of July. People are traveling more. There's a refinery that had a bad fire out in California. California traditionally has the highest gas prices in the country, and when you shut off a refinery, you end up with less supply, higher demand stays the same, prices go up, and that's what you're seeing there. I'm already seeing Newsweek saying gas prices are soaring with Trump in office. It's not like Trump set the refinery on fire. I don't think you can necessarily do that. On the other hand, I think this does indicate people are very sensitive to increases in gas prices. Remember, as we talked during the Biden years, everything you buy gets shipped usually on a truck or a train, and that's how it's got to get there. So when gas prices get up higher, transportation costs get higher, cost of everything else gets higher. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. Drill, baby, drill will help. I would also call for refine, baby, refine, because you can't put oil into your car. You gotta do stuff to turn it into usable fuel. We're also going to have that transition from the winter fuel to the summer fuel, and that usually causes some disruptions and stuff. So I'm not saying this is time for the administration to hit the panic button. He's been in office, look at that, 26 days, Greg. Does it feel like it's been a long year? Since inauguration way was So just keep an eye on this would be my recommendation. And I think that CBS poll said nobody expects quick action, the prices to drop immediately. But they expected to see results within about 6 months. Now, the other thing also is we have yet to impose. So we got the steel and the aluminum tariffs in. We have not put in the across-the-board tariffs on Canada and Mexico. The Canada one has had an exemption of 10%. It was going to be a 10% tariff on Canadian crude oil, which, by the way, goes to a lot of refineries in the U.S., particularly in the upper Midwest. And then we've got the reciprocal tariffs that are going to go into effect. If inflation is at 3% now, and you're going to enact all these things that are going to make foreign goods more expensive, I would expect CPI to creep up, which is not good. That is not what you want to have. Now, we're nearly a year away from gubernatorial elections in Virginia and New Jersey. We are nearly 2 years away from midterm elections. It's not like the administration has to panic about this now, but I do think you're going to see this become a louder murmur as the year goes on if prices continue to not. If it's 3% or more, people are going to notice that, and there's going to be you're going to start hearing some grumbling about, hey, where are these lower prices Trump was supposed to deliver? Yeah,
Trump has even said that if the tariffs took effect, that things would get temporarily more expensive, and the question is, what's your definition of temporarily? Like you said, the people have a few months of patience on this, but when they've elected you specifically to help bring these things down, their patience is not going to last real long. And so not the time to say, oh, well, this 3% is clearly his fault. It's not. But there will be results, like you said, expected, probably even before the end of this year, certainly by the time of the midterms. If things are not at least flattened out, if not better, there's going to be a price to pay, probably. So hopefully that's not the case. All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. And of course, as we've talked about, the left insists we're in a constitutional crisis. Constitutional crisis. All this unilateral executive action, unelected bureaucrats, even though the left loves unelected bureaucrats when they're lefties. They're just waiting for Trump to defy one of these district court judges on all these different injunctions. By last count, I think we're looking at about 60-some injunctions on Trump policies, so they can say, the death of democracy, the death of constitutional order, and all this stuff. But hats off over at Town Hall, the column by Josh Hammer. I think our friend Kurt Schlichter has written on this too, that basically this is a tired old game. You've got an energetic executive, more so from a Republican than you've probably seen in quite a while, with all these executive orders and other policies coming out. And then you've got what's known as the judicial resistance. And so the left loves to sue. So they file these cases based on these different Trump orders. And of course, they go judge shopping, which means you go find the most liberal district judge that would have relevance in the case. Then you have quite a bit of confidence that he would issue an injunction, which then gums up the works as you appeal it up the chain. Ultimately, the Supreme Court certainly leans in the direction of Trump. So as ultimately these cases get resolved, we're going to be right back where we started, with Trump getting most of what he wants, I would guess. But in a presidency where, you've only got 4 years, as much clock as you can run if you're the left has some value to it. So that part's infuriating, even though they're likely to lose in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is that not every constitutional dispute is a constitutional crisis. And what we have right now are constitutional disputes, meaning that Trump says, I have the authority to do this. And folks in the legislature and people outside, they'd say, no, you don't. Well, that's what the courts are there to do. Do you have the power? It does. And we're going to need a Supreme Court decision on all of this. But one, I find it more than a little bit ironic, Greg, that all of these Democrats who spent really the last 4 years arguing that the Supreme Court is corrupt. Yes. The Supreme Court needs ethics reforms because Clarence Thomas is always jet setting around the world on a beach somewhere. And that inherently means everything he said is illegitimate. We need to add more people to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court needs term limits. And and of course, as AOC said, Biden should ignore the courts. And now all of a sudden, we got it. Well, the court said it. You can't, now the courts are cool again. Lo and behold, now all of a sudden, look who's worried about the imperial presidency now. Greg, we should also point out, Trump was asked about this in the Oval Office, and he says, "Well, if I lose at the court, I'll just appeal. I'll obey the court, but I'll appeal." And I was like, "Okay, that's what you're supposed to do in that situation, right?" And yes, of course, there's judge shopping, and they're filing in the jurisdictions where they think they're most likely to get decisions. But eventually, this heads up through the federal court system and gets to judges who are less prone to give a Democratic complainant exactly what they want. The real crisis comes is when the court says, no, Mr. President, you cannot do X. And then Trump says, I'm going to do X anyway. That's a constitutional crisis. We haven't reached that point. Now, I do think the courts are likely to say you cannot suspend birthright citizenship through executive order. I think 3 judges have ruled against it so far, and that is a real stretch of the idea of the president's power. I think they're going to say if you get the congressional legislature to pass a bill and sign it into law that says, well, actually, when they enacted birthright citizenship, this was never meant to apply to the children of illegal immigrants. And if neither of your parents are in the country legally, you do not automatically get birthright citizenship. I think that's got a really good shot of getting at least 5 votes at the Supreme Court, maybe 6, maybe even more. That is a representation of the people's will, and that is the argument would be that birthright citizenship is not only in the Constitution under the 14th Amendment, but that it applies to anyone, no matter of any circumstances whatsoever. And we know that children of diplomats are not necessarily U.S. citizens and things like that. So that's what the courts are for. So no, we don't have a constitutional crisis right now. They'd like to people to believe that. But I think disagreeing about what the exact, definition of the president's power is under Article 1, it's really, like, that itself is not causing a constitutional crisis. That's a disagreement. When you start defying the courts, that's a one. But keep in mind, some of these injunctions are arguing was over the buyout offer. The argument that the president did not have the authority to offer federal employees, was it 6 months, 7 months, 8 months worth of payments? Yeah. 8 months worth of payments if you agree to resign, if stay home starting now. Why? Where in the Constitution does it say the president cannot offer buyouts? But Clinton did this back in the 90s. I don't remember. I was shocked when I read about that because I have no memory of that. And no, it was not because I was drinking then.
No, I think you're exactly right about this. And ultimately, it's going to matriculate up to the Supreme Court, at least on a lot of these cases. And so, yes, an issue like birthright citizenship, the 14th Amendment, clearly a critical part of our amendment process, equal protection under the law. I really wish it had been written a little more carefully so we would have to adjudicate all this, or redefining marriage in there. But that's an issue that should go up the chain in the court. There was a judge that issued an injunction about which pages ought to be on the HHS website. There's an injunction basically forcing the Trump administration to put gender-affirming care web pages back on the site. How in the world is that something that they're not allowed to do? It's just unbelievable.
I think right now, honest to goodness, the approach of the resistance or Trump is file the suit and see what the judge says. Worst thing that happened is the judge can say no. And I think that's, if I were them, that's probably what I'd be doing. What are you going to do? Count on congressional Democrats to save you?
Yeah, they're not in much of a position to do it. I just remember in the early days of the first Trump administration when they were trying to do the travel ban, and they kept chopping that same district judge out in Hawaii, and he was like making policy for the entire country at that point. Very bizarre when they do this. So hopefully the process works quickly. I know it often doesn't, but hopefully it does in this case.
Some would argue that, like, the president repeatedly getting overruled by a judge in Hawaii that nobody's ever heard of feels a little constitutional crazy. Like, wait a second, did we? But we'll this is how the system works for people.
Jim, you are actually going to be away for a while. Folks will find out soon enough where exactly that is, but we will miss you, and we look forward to having you back. Be safe until then.
I'm traveling, Jim said vaguely. Thanks for everyone for listening. I will be back in about 2 weeks. Knocking on wood. Everything should be fine. Everyone knows. This is where I say, quoting Indiana Jones, Greg, you know what a cautious fellow I am. And then I throw the revolver into the suitcase.
He's Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos, Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already on your favorite podcast platform, but also on YouTube. Also, thank you for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a terrific weekend and join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.